Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Graphics Card Performance Comparison. Today we are testing three different graphics cards. The AMD RX 580 8GB card, the GTX 1070, and the GTX 1080. Links to all three cards in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg, as well as to the full build video on the computer that these cards are installed in. We are testing today on the $1,500 i7 7700K build. It is running at a fixed overclock of 4.7 GHz, 16 GB of DDR4 3200 is installed. Check that computer out in the link below. Fraps was used for the game performance numbers you will see in the charts at the end of this video. It was not used to capture the video you're watching. Instead, an external Elgato HD60X capture card was used for the video. There is no performance loss since the computer doesn't even know it was being recorded. The numbers in the upper left-hand corner are for MSI Afterburner, a free tool you can download to get real-time information on what your computer, your graphics card, CPU, and system memory are doing in real time while you're playing. First up, we have the RX 580 playing The Division. Now this is the Gigabyte Aurora card. It is a factory overclocked top of the line RX 580. I really like this card for several reasons. First, it's extremely silent. The fans are turning at a rated 37% or about 1250 RPM, but they are so unbelievably quiet. These are 100mm fans. The heatsink is massive on this thing. It does overclock further, although the fans have to be turned up a bit in order to get it up to about 1500 MHz, so I'm running it at the out-of-the-box configuration. Now this is going to be a bit of a longer video. Timestamps are in the video description below. If you get bored and you don't want any gameplay commentary, you can skip to each of the cards within the video and then to the final results if you want. However, this mission you're watching right here is the final story-based mission of the game, and I'm actually recorded the whole thing. I won't leave the whole thing in, I'll cut to pieces of it, but this is the final scene against Bliss with the helicopter and the turrets. And I am very proud to report I beat it on the first try, although it was touch and go several times. The main reason for that is because I learned all about gear. The first half of this game, frankly, I really struggled a lot. I've been playing this since before Christmas. I gave it up for a couple of months, came back to it, and the truth is I didn't quite realize how important gear rating was, the level of your gear. I looked at the stats, I looked at the DPS numbers and thought, oh, my gun's fine, my armor seems okay. But what I didn't realize is there's a penalty applied of some type. I don't know the exact numbers, but when your weapon and your other gear gets more than about 3 or 4 levels beneath your level or the enemies you're fighting, it becomes ineffective really fast. I spent a bunch of the in-game credits to upgrade my gear just before doing this, and lo and behold, it really made a difference. But back to gameplay commentary in a minute. First, let's talk performance, because that's probably why you're here. Looking at our real-time numbers, you'll see that our graphics chip is 100% utilized. That's that first percentage on the first line of MSI Afterburner. Most games are generally graphics card limited. There are absolutely exceptions, but in general, you'll find that your graphics card is usually a limitation before your CPU is. Now I am testing this today on an i7 7700K overclocked to a fixed 4.7 GHz on all 4 cores. Now the out-of-the-box turbo speed on this chip is 4.5, but that's only on a single core. The 4-core out-of-the-box speed is 4.2, so we essentially have a 500 MHz overclock. I have a 120mm liquid cooler installed. I will be doing an upgrade on this build. By the way, the full build list of this computer is in the video description below if you want to see it. But I am going to be upgrading the case, power supply, and cooler on this CPU, on this build, and I'll be doing a video on that at some point in the future. Cooler Master was very nice and sent me a beautiful 280mm Master Liquid Pro liquid cooler and a very nice Master Case Pro 6. Brand new, just released in the US this month, and I'm going to be doing a conversion, moving it from the Master Box 5 that I built this system in to the Master Case Pro 6 and putting a proper liquid cooler, because I only have 120mm on it now, 280. I not only want to see if this will run at 5 GHz, I want to see if I can get 5.2 or maybe even 5.3 out of it and make this the ultimate gaming machine. Now, while it is true that in the long run, I do think the extra cores and threads of Ryzen processors, specifically the Ryzen 5 1600 and the Ryzen 7 1700, are better long-term bets for gaming. Today in 2017, in terms of pure frame rate, the maximum performance in gaming, you really can't beat the 7700K. Its performance is faster than Ryzen because of its clock speed and instructions per clock cycle benefits. Now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I don't think that 4 cores and 8 threads is going to be enough to play the latest and greatest games. If you want to build a machine today that's going to last you 5 years, I would definitely go with a Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7. But if you upgrade your machine more often, maybe you just want 2 years of use out of it, the 7700K is faster. It is worth noting that you pay a pretty penny for that, however. The 7700K is a $350 processor, and you'll need about a $150 motherboard in order to overclock it. Then you install a $100 liquid cooler on it, and you're looking at $350 plus $150 plus $100. You're looking at $600 for motherboard, CPU, and the liquid cooler. Compare that to Ryzen 5 1600, which comes with an excellent 95-watt Wraithspire cooler already in the box. $220 for the CPU, $100 for a B350 motherboard, and for $320, you have 6 cores, 12 threads, easily overclockable to about 3.7 gigahertz. No, it's not as fast per core, but it's also almost half the price of the i7 7700K. The 50% more cores and more threads provides some future proofing. It gives you some room to grow over the next 5 years with more cores and more threads than the 7700K. And while it is not as fast in terms of clock speed or per core performance, it is generally fast enough for most situations. The single biggest exception is high refresh rate gaming. If you are playing today on a 144 Hz or faster monitor and you want to play modern games at high frame rates, yes, the 7700K probably is a better bet because Ryzen doesn't scale to high frame rates as well as it scales to smooth frame rates. I find that at 60 to 100 frames per second, Ryzen is generally a smoother, better overall experience than the i7 is, but the i7 does in fact provide faster total frame rates if that's of concern to you. I want to draw your attention now back to line 2 of the MSI Afterburner numbers. There is 8 gigabytes of RAM on all 3 of these cards, and that is absolutely plenty for anything you'd want to do in the next couple of years with these cards. We are currently using about 5 gigabytes of it. Now that doesn't mean that this wouldn't run at ultra detail on an RX 580 4 gigabyte card, it just may not be quite as smooth as the game has to swap out textures. The reality is many games allocate more RAM than they actually need to use at any one time. If the RAM's there, you want the game to use it. You want it to allocate that RAM and save the trouble of having to load textures and other information into video RAM. Some games suffer a performance hit when they run short of it, some don't. You have to test it both ways to see how much it matters. That being said, if you want to play at ultra detail in 2017, you really should have the 8 gig version. There's now a $30 price difference between the 4 gig and the 8 gig version of the RX 580. That wasn't the case when the cards first came out. There was closer to a $60 price difference. At $60, I made the argument last year in the summer of 2016 that A, the games that were out in 2016 didn't really need more than 4, and B, for $60 it wasn't worth the money because other than the VRAM, there was no performance difference between the two cards. Now that we're into 2017 and now there's a $30 difference, buy the 8 gig card. It's worth the extra $30 for the longevity and usefulness of the card. Coming down to line 4, we are using 8.5 gigabytes of our 16 gigabytes of main system RAM. Now that is just the amount that's actually allocated for the programs that are running. First of all, remember that MSI Afterburner and Fraps are the only other 2 things I'm running on this machine, and while they use a little bit of RAM, it is seriously not much. I have run both programs on very, very resource-constrained machines, and they really don't take much performance or much memory. The only other thing running is the game itself. I don't have any other background tasks. This is a test machine. I don't have a bunch of extra programs loaded. So this is an optimal configuration with a fresh install of Windows 10 and nothing else running. Windows is, however, using more than 8.5 gigs of RAM. In fact, I can tell you for 100% certainty, Windows is actually using all 16 gigabytes of the RAM. The extra RAM that's being used is being used for disk cache and swap file. All the elements on the drive from this game and used for Windows are being kept in the unused portion of RAM to avoid wear and tear on either the hard drive or the solid state drive that the game or whatever else you're running is on. This game is a whole lot larger than 8 or 16 gigabytes. In fact, it's over 50 gigabytes. As we move around from area to area, there are many different elements, different voices, textures, things that have to be loaded into the game. You quick travel, you reload save games. There's a lot going on besides what the game itself is just using, and Windows uses that basically to load elements more quickly and to save elements you've previously used for reuse without having to pull them from either the hard drive or the SSD. Even if you have an SSD, and SSDs are really fast, main system RAM is still several orders of magnitude faster in both transfer rate and response time, latency, compared to main system RAM. Now, can you play games in 2017 such as The Division, Ghost Recon Wildland, etc. in 8 gigs of RAM? Absolutely, of course you can. It'll be a little bit slower in terms of latency and performance, but not a ton. It will, in fact, be a very minor difference, but there is one. If you have a nice high-end computer with a Ryzen 5 or an i7 CPU, if you've got yourself a 250, 350 or more video card, the $50 price difference between 8 and 16 gigs of RAM should not be a serious issue, and it does in fact improve your overall system responsiveness. I would also like to remind you that unless you run a completely clean machine, you are likely to use more RAM than I am because you actually have programs installed, things running in the background, utilities, things in the task tray. You just use your computer over time and it takes up space, and because of that, it slowly creeps your RAM use over time. Now let's come back to the performance numbers for a minute. Look at our real-time frame rate. We were, when I said that, just bouncing around 60 frames a second. We dipped up to just over 70 frames, and we're back to 60. Frame rate is highly variable because we're GPU limited, and so rather than being set to VSync, set to say a 60 Hz monitor refresh rate, the frame rate varies depending upon where I'm looking and what I'm doing. Now this is that last battle I was mentioning earlier. This is the big battle with the helicopter that comes overhead and the turrets, and I gotta tell you, this was pretty cool and epic. They need more of these kind of battles in the game. Now, the turret mechanic was kind of interesting, but it took me a while to figure out where to go to actually press F and actually activate the turrets manually. I ran around a bit being shot by the helicopter going, Now, you can actually damage the helicopter by shooting it, but you would run out of bullets before you shot the thing down. You need to get rid of the helicopter's armor before your bullets do very much to it, at least with the weapons that I'm carrying in any case. While The Division is not a brand new game, it still looks absolutely incredible, especially at higher detail levels. Parts of New York, the vehicles, the terrain, the walls, the trash, the people. It is a beautiful, beautiful game. And you can now get it on a discount. There are links in the description below, not just to Amazon, but also to Kingwin and G2A, where you can get a copy of the game key. There is a season pass available, and there are some expansions. They are still actively developing and adding content to it. In fact, I believe they just recently added another expansion. Now, I haven't played any of that yet. In fact, this video right here is me finishing the main story. Then there's more to do beyond this. There's daily missions, there are additional levels of equipment you can upgrade, and then there's something called world tier difficulty levels where you can further enhance the difficulty of all the enemies on the streets, and then as you raise the world tier difficulty, they drop better gear. But of course you then need better gear in order to fight them. Does that sound like a treadmill? Well, it probably is to a certain extent, but it gives you something to do once the main story is done. Now there's still going to be encounters and random battles and surprise events, and as I said before, they're tossing additional events into the game as it progresses. Now, one place I haven't spent a lot of time is something called the Dark Zone. It's sort of the Central Park area of New York. It's in the center, and the Dark Zone essentially has PvP areas if you want to do PvP fighting. There are additional elements in there. The rules are a little bit different in the Dark Zone. When you go in there, there is Dark Zone specific gear that you can earn, And gear that you loot, you don't actually get to keep unless you extract from the Dark Zone. So if you die there, the loot stays there. You'd have to go back and get it. Once it's extracted, then you have to go to a stash to actually get the gear cleaned and extract from that point. So if you die in there, you don't get to keep your drops. I'm now going to fast forward just a bit to one of the last set piece battles here before you go outside to fight the helicopter. I'm only going to show this to you for a minute, and then I'll switch to the helicopter, and then we'll move on to the other two graphics cards. The only reason I'm putting this much in here is because this is in fact the last main battle. It was so epic, I want to use the footage somewhere. This is where I happen to capture it, so you're getting to see it. This is what the timestamps in the video description are for. If you don't want to see this piece of the battle, click the link in the video description below to fast forward automatically. When you click that time, it will jump you ahead to the GTX 1070. And then there'll be a link to the 1080, so you can watch as much or as little of each of these cards' real-time performance that you actually want to see. So for those of you who want to see all of this, here you go. This room is a great example of the awesome set piece battles that the Division gives you. There are higher elevations, lower elevations, obstacles on the left and right side of the room, multiple levels to get at, places to throw turrets. You could use seeker mines that would then run between the various banisters. You can use grenades. There's snipers. In fact, you can see me shooting at the sniper up there. That is actually a elite sniper. That's a yellow one as opposed to just the mid-level ones, which are colored in purple. Those guys can be pretty tough, but thankfully I've upgraded my weapons, and so I can do a pretty good job against those guys. Of course, as is the case of many of these type of battles, I'm at the top of the room fighting enemies at the bottom of the room. Once I clear out the enemies at the bottom of the room, I'll then go down there, and there's a laptop I have to use. Once I use it, enemies then come into the top of the room where I once was, and so basically you end up fighting the battle in reverse. You have to give the designers of this game some credit. They got use out of their various environments that they built. I'm sure it takes a lot of hours of work to make a room like this, placing everything, spacing out the size, testing battles in them to make sure it works, testing the AI to make sure that the AI can use the room, making sure that there's different places you can hide. Do you want to go left side, right up the center? What kind of weapons? Maybe you've got a character equipped with sniper rifles. Maybe you use shotguns and close quarter battle weapons. The room needs to be designed so that each different kind of player has options to work with. And then somebody had to place all these elements, the computers, the boxes, the various stuff throughout the room that gives it color and feel. Look at the detailed room. Look at the art on the walls. Look at the computer and the speakers on the walls. Look at the ceiling and all the lights. It looks like a real conference room or a real work display room. The floor, the tile, the carpet. There's a little poster thing on the left there. You can see Post-it notes, yellow Post-it notes next to the map. The texture quality, the details on the textures here. You can see the computer screen with the blue words over there. It almost looks like a blue screen of death, ironically enough, considering we're being shot at. Look at the back of the computer. You can even see the little ATX cutout from the PC. The details. And to be honest, there's two letter boxes there, paper boxes. Look at the chair and the cushions. You can see, I know I'm kind of marveling a bit. The funny thing is, you don't see this stuff when you're playing the game. The truth of the matter is you're so busy trying not to die, you don't even notice it. But I'm actually watching this in detail for the first time, and I'm marveling a bit at how much is really, they put a lot of work into making this room pretty. Now, it is true that a wide variety of rooms and places throughout the game are really duplicates of each other. Some of them have certain elements rearranged or colors changed or the furniture moved a bit, but the truth is, once you've been into a certain number of buildings and you've been up the stairs and around the hallways, you discover there is a certain element of sameness to it. Well, there has to be. There simply would never be enough developer time in the world, at least not economically so, in order to make every building and every location in a game such as this unique. This might be unique, although probably not. This probably exists in a few other places of the game, although it feels fairly unique. This sort of set piece area, they probably put more effort into than your average run-of-the-mill mission built into the game. But the main story missions, the main elements of the game, they certainly probably put extra in because those are kind of the highlight of the game. Well, I was all set to include the helicopter battle in here, but then I looked down at the time and noticed we're approaching 20 minutes. I'm not going to. I'm now going to transition to the next card. This video is long enough as it is. So moving on to the GTX 1070. This is the Gigabyte G1 gaming graphics card. I've previously covered this card in my which GTX 1070 graphics card should you buy, and essentially my advice then is pretty much the same as my advice today. All these cards are generally about the same performance. Buy based upon price, color preference, fan preference, how much overclocking you might want to do or might not want to do. Buy based upon which brand you personally prefer. These are all extremely similar in performance. Now, if you look up at the very first line on the screen, you'll see that our clock speed is running just short of 2 gigahertz. Now, full disclosure, this does not actually auto boost quite to 2 gigahertz. Each card auto boosts to a different speed, and that speed often varies from game run to game run. In fact, this particular card, I have seen as much of about a 40 to 50 megahertz clock speed variance depending upon which game you run. That is NVIDIA's GPU Boost 3.0 running. However, let me state that every single 10 series card that I have, every 1060, 1070, and 1080 that I have, and I have a bunch of them, all run perfectly at 2 gigahertz without complaint. And there's no voltage changes required for that to happen. My suggestion would be for you to install MSI Afterburner and, first of all, play the game and see what clock speed you get. Subtract 2000 from that clock speed, and because NVIDIA GPUs use an offset, in this case you would type in, for example, a plus 13 or a plus 15 if you want to get it to exactly 2 gigahertz. Now, this card out of the box was closer to 1900 megahertz. In fact, if memory serves, it was around 1925 megahertz. So you put in a plus 75 and that should give you 2 gigahertz, right? Except it doesn't always work that way because it does vary by a little bit. Now, the reality is the 13 megahertz we're short of 2000 is a completely trivial number and will never show up anywhere in any performance benchmark. It's all in your head as simply not being there. Now, you can type in a plus 85 if you want, but oftentimes the performance won't change. The GPU boost will keep it at 1987. If I close this game and relaunch it without changing any settings, it might be at 2000. Sometimes it'll be at 2012. It kind of jumps in 12 and 13 megahertz increments, depending upon what GPU boost senses when the game launches, or who knows, maybe where the moon phase position is. Now, AMD cards use a different method of overclocking. Those use absolute clock rates. So, for example, on the RX 580, let's say you buy one of the $230 to $250 cards. Those generally run between 1340 megahertz to 1365 out of the box. In MSI Afterburner, you would type in the clock speed you want. So you might type in 1400 for 1400 megahertz. You could type in 1425 to make it run like this Gigabyte Aurora's card does. So it's not an offset. You type in a specific number and the card will try to run at that speed. Whereas the NVIDIA cards use an offset, so it's plus 50 or plus 65. Please note that when it comes to overclocking, putting in too high of a number, worst case scenario, will just cause your machine to crash. It should not be possible to hurt your graphics card by putting in too high of a number. It simply would either go to a complete black screen or would blue screen the machine and you'd have to reset it. Make sure in MSI Afterburner you do not click the Start with Windows button on the main actual page, because that will force the auto overclocking, that will force the overclock speed on reboot and makes it difficult to back in. You want to test and try it out where you have to enter the speed every time Windows boots. This way, if there's a problem, you can reset your machine and the card will go back to its factory default setting. You're only changing it for that boot session, not permanently. Now, what does kill graphics cards and CPUs in general is voltage. I do not recommend you mess with the voltage. Yes, you can unlock the voltage control in MSI Afterburner. Yes, you can increase them. But there's not a lot of voltage to be increased, and temperatures go up very quickly when you increase voltage. If you accidentally type the wrong voltage in, and this is true of CPUs as well as graphics cards, you can instantly fry your chip, rendering it permanently useless. Graphics cards and CPUs today all come with thermal protection. If they get too hot, they will throttle themselves. You will not burn up a chip by running its temperature too high. They will downclock themselves or simply shut themselves off to prevent over-temping. But they have no such protection for voltage. Leave voltage alone. In my opinion, most people, unless you really know what you're doing and you're willing to accept the risks of a fried chip, play with clock speed, play with fan speed, leave voltage at the standard defaults. Now, how's performance on this GTX 1070? Nothing short of awesome. We're at 90, 95 frames per second. Same detail settings, everything set to ultra preset with VSync turned off, and we are rocking along over 90 frames per second. The GTX 1070 really is quite a bit faster than that RX 570. Now, it's not going to be as fast in every game, and it only shows an improvement if the game you're playing is graphics card bound. If you're playing League of Legends, it's not going to make any difference. If you're playing Overwatch, well, beyond a certain point, for example at 1080p, it's not going to make a difference. It would at 1440p or 4K. But games like Overwatch don't really need a GTX 1070 unless 150 frames per second is your goal, and that's a separate topic. But for games such as Ghost Recon Wildlands, The Division, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Grand Theft Auto 5, Battlefield 1, these games are generally all graphics card bound. So long as you have a reasonably modern, reasonably fast processor, your graphics card is the limitation. So if you want to crank it up to ultra detail, there really is a lot of performance to be gained out of something like a GTX 1070. The only exceptions to that rule would be games that are heavily AMD optimized. What are the two big examples right now? Doom and Ashes of the Singularity. Those two games are basically AMD marketing materials in disguise of a game. Okay, Doom might be fun. It's not my personal cup of tea, but it is a real game. I'm not sure Ashes is a real game. That might just be a benchmark in disguise. Those games love AMD cards. So they perform so well on the RX 580 that the GTX 1070 does not show a huge improvement. But they're the exception that proves the rule. Across the board on everything else, you will see a fairly big difference. It does depend upon the age of the game. This game is about a year old. Ghost Recon Wildlands is almost brand new. Now, I've already filmed and done the voiceover of Ghost Recon Wildlands comparison between these three graphics cards. I have one more to do, which I have filmed but not done the voiceover yet, and I have not created the benchmark, the graphs at the end of the video, so I actually don't off the top of my head remember where that was at. But I did Assassin's Creed Syndicate. That one's coming up next as well, and that game is incredibly graphics card bound. In fact, at ultra detail, that thing is absolutely punishing to graphics cards, even more so to some extent than Ghost Recon Wildlands was. Now I'm fast forwarding to later in this replay just to show you one of the missions. This is a side mission. There's nothing story specific about what you're about to see here, but this is an example of sort of the filler within the game. You've got to defend some supplies, you've got to defeat these enemies, and then once you do so, more waves of enemies show up. These kind of missions show up all over this game. It basically gives you a reason to shoot these guys as opposed to random guys sitting on the street. We'll go up this handy zip line, which is just conveniently laying there for us. Here are the supplies. Now we have to kill that guy and kill the other guy at the top of the stairs, and then more waves of guys will show up. Random side note, one of the questions many people might ask is, wait a minute, doesn't this game have a built-in benchmark? Why don't you just run the benchmark on the three graphics cards and this video will be over in 5 minutes? Well, the built-in benchmark is fine if you just want to know absolute possible performance comparisons between graphics cards, but it doesn't tell you how well the game will actually play on the cards. The benchmark is not the game. You're not actually controlling a character. You're not experiencing the input lag. You are not having an effect on the action that takes place on the screen. I think very poorly of built-in game benchmarks when it comes to answering the question, will this card at this detail and resolution play this game? It will tell you that card A is faster than card B, perhaps, assuming it's reflective of the game performance in general. But I think that actually playing the game and playing the game for a decent length of time, over 15 to 30 minutes, depending upon the game. I do different games for different lengths, but in this particular case, I ran each of these for over 30 minutes each on each card. That gives an honest-to-goodness, real-world idea of what the average performance is, as well as what the 1% and 0.1% minimums are. Now, the average performance is going to include some very high peaks and some very low lows, given that occasionally the map loads and you quick travel places and you run between locations and not much is going on. But that's how you play the game. And then you end up in these firefights. And I try to include this stuff when I show you the video. I'm not showing you all the boring running around spots because, frankly, for 30 minutes that would be kind of boring. But look at this, we're engaged with multiple enemies respawning multiple times, and we're getting 95 frames per second. Ultra detail 1080p. Frankly, this card would play this game at 1440p, although ultra detail would be awfully challenging. With ultra detail, the frame rate would be dipping at times below 60 frames per second. Selecting high detail for 1440p would provide a much better gaming experience. If you really want 60 plus frames per second at ultra detail at 1440p, well, that's what the 1080 is for. But we're not doing 1440p today, we're doing 1080p. As a side note, one question that often get asked is, why don't I include multiple resolutions and multiple details in these videos? Now, I actually could. Given the length of this video, I could certainly make it shorter per run and then put more information in. In other words, I could do like 3 minutes at 1080p, 3 minutes at 1440p, 3 minutes at high detail, 3 minutes at ultra. But that's just the length of this video. That's not the amount of time to test. Now, if I was using the built-in benchmark, sure, I could do a 30-minute video and include like every resolution and every detail setting. But again, that doesn't reflect the game. Even if I only wanted to play the game for 15 minutes at each detail and each resolution, I'd be looking at an all-day affair to test 3 different graphics cards at 3 different detail settings and 3 different resolutions. And then to edit all that together and to keep it straight creates a lot of work on the back end that you don't see when making a video. Now, some of you are going to say, oh, well, great, play me the world's smallest violin. You make YouTube videos and play video games for a living. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. There are other videos to make besides this one. If I only published 3 videos a week, or if maybe I had somebody helping me with video editing, yeah, I actually probably would do more of that. But doing everything yourself simply means that time is always a limitation. I would also like to point out that these 3 graphics cards are only getting these 3 games tested. I don't currently plan to do more than Ghost Recon Wildlands, The Division, and Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Now, when I did the last video card comparison, which was RX 570, 580, and the 2 GTX 1060 cards, I tested 17 different games. I might have gotten carried away with myself there. The reality is that was too many games. And even then, people keep saying, why don't you test this game? Why don't you? I understand. People want to see their favorite game tested. I don't blame them. It's fine. There's nothing wrong whatsoever with saying, hey, would you test this? Just don't be upset when the answer is no. Because the amount of time and work that goes into these far exceeds just a 20 or 30 or even a 50-minute video and the time just to play the games. Just a quick side note, this is a good place to transition to the GTX 1080. That side mission was completed, and so now we're going to show you another mission here. By the way, that's a nice looking Christmas tree. Now, this graphics card is the EVGA for the win. It is an awesome card and one of my favorites. The fan speed is low, the clock speed is high, the temperature is low. These cards are wonderful. Now, they are premium priced, although on the day I recorded this voiceover, you could find this exact card for $500 even on Newegg. Again, prices change all the time. Use the links below, compare Amazon and Newegg, buy it where it makes the most sense to you, but you can in fact get the For the Win card from EVGA for $499, and I think it's 95 cents or whatever it is, but basically it's $500. And this is a great card. Look at our temperature, 68 degrees Celsius on the graphics card. Considering the overclock, we are at almost 2.1 gigahertz. That is a comfortable overclock on this card, but it's not stressing it out. Now, the fan speed's at 56%. Please note that that fan speed is auto curve. I did not manually adjust that fan speed. Because the For the Win card has much larger fans and a much larger heatsink than the superclocked and the non-overclock cards, and even, for example, the Gigabyte G1 Gaming doesn't have as large a fans. This has 2 large fans as opposed to 3 smaller fans. It's still very, very quiet. The 120mm liquid cooler in my i7 is louder than this For the Win card is. If it was loud, I'd tell you it is, but it's not. This thing is silent as can be. If you've been following my channel for the past year or so, you will have seen many different EVGA reviews, including an unboxing and review of this card. I really am a fan, so I wear my bias on my sleeve. Now, that doesn't make it the only choice you can go for. The Zotac Amp Extreme Edition would also do very, very well. The MSI Gaming X card has big fans, very similar in size to this one, a big oversized heatsink, very similar to this one. It should also do about 2.1 gigahertz. No, I didn't change voltage. As I said, we're running auto fan curve. It's very, very nice. But before you get too excited about all that wonderful performance, let me offer you this thought. Every single other card I have runs perfectly at 2.0 gigahertz. This is running at almost 2.1. Not all the cards will do 2.1. What is the real performance difference between 2.0 and 2.1? 5%. And that's clock speed, not performance difference. Because of the fact that the VRAM and your CPU and your main system RAM, nothing else changes, just that one clock speed, you won't get 5% more frames per second by increasing the graphics card's clock speed by 5%. You will get more, but it might only be, say, 3%. If the game is running, as it is right now, at 130, 100 and almost 40 frames per second, then you're going to be looking at, anywhere between 4 to 5 frames per second more than if we were running, for example, the Gigabyte G1 or the superclocked version of this card, which does have smaller fans and only at 2 gigahertz. Okay, so we're currently doing, at this point where there was fire, there was 105 frames, now we're at 100. Look at the variability of the frame rate. It is so inconsistent. Now, if you have, for example, a 100 hertz 1080p monitor, then you'd have a solid 100 frames per second. But notice that even with the GTX 1080, you would not be getting a solid 144 frames per second if you have a 1080p 144 hertz monitor. You would need to turn the detail down to high to get that, or you'd need to upgrade to a 1080 Ti, but those things are $700. That's a lot of money to spend to play at 1080p, in my opinion. But for the sake of discussion, let's say we're getting 130 frames per second. Even if you subtract 5 off of that, fine, you're getting 125 frames per second. Is the cost difference worth stressing over? If you find a really great deal, let's say you find for, say, $460 or $470, a non-ultimate card like this, maybe you find the Superclock card or something less expensive for $30 less. Are you willing to save $30 to run at 125 frames per second instead of 130? For enthusiasts and people who want maximum overclock and maximum performance, these top-end For the Win cards, AMP Extreme Edition cards, Gaming X cards, they're wonderful. But in terms of dollars per unit of performance, even heavily overclocked, they generally aren't the deal. Generally, the mid-range or even lower-end cards are often a better deal in terms of price to performance than these super-duper versions, which do overclock faster and do generally run a bit cooler in terms of dollars per frame rate given. Now, in just a minute, I am going to cut to the performance slides, but I'm going to have 2 different slides in this video. This is the very first time I'm doing this. The first slide is going to have the raw performance numbers, average frame rate, and then 1% lows and 0.1% lows. The second slide is going to have dollars per FPS. In other words, how many dollars does each card cost per frame rate it gives? And I will break that down in terms of average, the 1%, and the 0.1% lows. So the question is, how many dollars does each FPS? To give you a simple example, if a card gives you an average of 100 frames per second and it costs $300, then it's costing you $3 per frame per second. If you can buy a similar card that gives you the same frame rate for $250, then it would be $2.50 per frame per second. But that's a simplistic explanation. The real question is, does a $250 RX 580 give you more or fewer frames per second than a $350 GTX 1070? And does a $500 GTX 1080 actually give you more performance per dollar spent, or does it give you worse? This is the first set of videos I've ever done this comparison on, and I really would like to get some feedback from you guys as to whether or not this is useful information and if you like the way it's presented. Now, Ghost Recon Wildlands had it, this has it, and Assassin's Creed Syndicate has it. I'm doing 3 games on these 3 cards, sort of to try something a little bit different, presenting it from the value equation. Yes, of course, obviously this card costs the most. It's $500. It's double the price of the RX 580. Does it give you double the performance? No, not really, but it might be close in certain situations. And if you want that extra performance, it's worth considering the question, are you getting value for the money? Now, sometimes you have to pay a premium to be on the top of the heap. How much premium are you paying? It's faster, but how much faster? how much are you paying over and above what it would cost to get truly double the performance? If you're paying double the price, but you're getting 70% more performance, that might still be worthwhile if you want to play games at 100 to 144 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second. Notice we're getting 130, 135 frames per second right here. That's pretty good. Now, granted, we're at 1080p and we're on a $500 graphics card. But just a few months ago, this was a $700 graphics card. The price of this came down when the 1080 Ti came out. I haven't actually done a lot of videos lately on the 1070 and 1080, but I wanted to do these, and I'll probably do a few more in maybe different configurations or maybe higher resolutions, because with the recent price drops, you can actually now find GTX 1070s for closer to 300 than to 350. In the chart I'm going to show you in this video, I went with 350 because that's sort of an average price. You can find a number of different cards at that price. Although there's at least 2 different cards at the beginning of May when I'm recording this that were at least $20 under that. But I'm trying to go with a reasonable middle of the road price rather than the absolute least expensive card, which may or may not be available on the day you're watching this video. Background note for anyone who's curious. These videos are all recorded usually a week or two before I actually upload them, and the voiceovers are generally done anywhere from a few days to a week before I publish them. I usually have 5 or 6 videos uploaded and ready to go at any one time, and then I publish them, usually 1 per day, sometimes 2 per day if it's a weekend or a holiday or something else, or maybe if I publish a video in the morning and it's not getting a lot of views, I might toss out a second one in the afternoon. Now, from time to time, either I've been sick or on vacation, I have been without a video for a day or two, especially when I was moving locations. I used to film in an office, now I film at home, and so there was a couple of days missed in there as I was making that transition. So when I comment on prices, some people might say, well, why don't you just say what they are on the time you publish the video? I am actually doing this voiceover May 3rd, 2017, is when I'm actually recording the audio. This game was played back in April. You might not see this video until May 7th or May 10th. Who knows when I'll publish it? I'll do batches of these. I'll do 3 or 4, in fact, all 3 of these games were voiced over on the same day. They won't be published on the same day. None of this is important from your perspective, but it's kind of background information. And since we're 41 minutes into the video, I figure anybody still watching at this point and hasn't clicked the links in the description and the timeline, you might be interested. So I'm sharing it with you as to how this works. I have done a lot of game performance videos in the past couple of weeks. Part of that has been recovering from the move and just trying to get myself organized in my new filming location. I am going to get back to hardware videos. In fact, you might even see 1 or 2 before this publishes. We'll see how that goes. I've got 2 computer hardware builds coming up soon. A full Ryzen 5 1600 build is coming, and then I'm also going to be doing a rebuild of this i7 7700K. I think I mentioned that earlier in the video, but that was 40 minutes ago, so who knows what I said. Well, that's enough filling time. Let's take a look at the results. First detail slide, we have the actual frame rates. The green bars are average, the red bars are the 1% minimums, and the blue bars are the 0.1% minimums. 81 frames per second average at ultra detail at 1080p on the RX 580, 99 frames per second on the 1070, and 120 frames per second on the GTX 1080. Needless to say, all 3 of these cards do in fact provide great 1080p gaming performance. If you just want to play at 60 frames per second, an RX 580 is really all you need for The Division. Even the 1% lows, the performance you'll get at least 99% of the time is 56 frames per second. Interestingly enough, same thing with the GTX 1070, 56 frames per second, but the 1080 did do better at 71. What is very interesting is the performance scaling here is nice even stair steps, at least in terms of average frame rate, 81 to 99 to 120. The reason I put so much of the gameplay in here is simply to show you the fact that regardless of the charts, regardless of the 1% and 0.1% minimums that you see here, watch the gameplay in combat. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of the time, these games perform very, very well on these cards, and you really do get close to that average, plus or minus 10 or 20% most of the time, even in heavy combat. Now, before I jump to the next slide, I want to point something out. The RX 580 generally averages about $250. The GTX 1080 averages $500, double the money. Is it double the performance? No, of course not. It rarely works that way, but it is 50% faster, 81 to 120 is about 50% more performance for double the money. You do pay a premium to get there. Is it worth it? That's a personal choice. If you want to play at 100 frames a second or 120 frames per second, well, and you want to do ultra detail, you'll need a GTX 1080. An RX 580 is not going to cut it. But you could lower the detail settings, lower it to high or even to medium, and that RX 580 would run at 120 all day long. If we transition to the second chart, lower is better here. This is how many dollars you're spending per frame per second using each of the three metrics, average, 1% minimum, and 0.1% minimum. Now here, the RX 580 is the deal. $3.10 per frame per second on a $250 RX 580, $3.50 for the GTX 1070, and $4.20 for the GTX 1080. The reality is while the RX 580 is less expensive, $3.10 per frame to $3.50 is really not that far apart. They are closer than you'd think. Now the red bars, the 1% minimum, are much further apart, and that's because the GTX 1070 did in fact perform the same at the 1% number on both runs. Now I played all these games for at least 30 minutes on each card. Why is it down there at 56 frames per second on the 1070? Just where I was, the maps I was doing, there was a few hitches, a few loading screens that tossed the frame rate down there. If you actually watched the game played, and if you skipped to these performance numbers and didn't really watch it all, that's why the video's here. If you're going to go post below, well, how come they're both the same? That doesn't make any sense. Well, you didn't watch the video then, because if you watched the combat, it wasn't. So this is the problem with benchmark charts. This is the entire problem with benchmark charts, and this is why this video is 45 plus minutes long with all that gameplay. No, you don't have to watch all of it, but if you want to know why these performance numbers are the way they are, watch the video. Watch the play during combat, and then see if these numbers coincide with it. I am reporting the numbers that Fraps gave me for the runs. You're watching the video that was recorded while Fraps was benchmarking, full stop. I present the numbers as I got them, no more and no less. I don't really believe that 56 frames per second, 1% low is very useful in terms of the GTX 1070. I think that is from a loading screen or a fast travel screen or the map. Something in there caused that to be that way, and it's not reflective of the game performance. Ideally, I would reshoot that. It takes a lot of time and effort to go back and refilm these, and so I'm not going to, and all I'll tell you is to watch the video and see if it's that bad. Moving on to the 1080, it is of course the most expensive card here, but that really shouldn't surprise anybody. You pay a premium to get a premium part. But if you want to play at high refresh rates at ultra detail, there you are. Now, I am planning on using this particular chart in future videos. As I said before, leave me a comment down in the description below if you like this chart, if you like this sort of information. I'm trying to look at this from different points of view and give people more information so they can make their own decision when it comes to buying parts. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below the video. Post your comments below the video. Check the links in the video description. The links to Amazon and Newegg will be for these three graphics cards. I would greatly appreciate it if you use those while shopping. It does make a difference. The link to buy Ghost Recon Wildland is going to be down there to Amazon, Kingwin, and G2A. Those are also useful links. Finally, my Patreon link will be down there. Patreon is a way for you to contribute directly to the channel. It helps me stay unbiased and tell you what I really think. The more contributions I get from viewers like you, the more I'm able to buy and review stuff you really want to see, independent of manufacturer support. I would greatly appreciate anything you can contribute. Even $1 per month is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.